Duncan Campbell. I used to be the crime correspondent at The Guardian, and I've been asked to give a little talk on Miscarriages of Justice, and you will see when you see the play later on tonight the relevance of one particular case. So I'm going to run through briefly the British history of miscarriages of justice, and then if people have contributions or questions in a little while we can deal with that. I think when people talk about miscarriages of justice in this country, they tend to think of the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4 and the Maguire 7, that particular period when people suddenly realised, both politically and in the media, that there was a scandal taking place in our criminal justice system, and that lots of innocent people were spending time behind bars, having been bullied into confessions or fitted up in various different ways. And there was an idea that, that this had not really happened before and could be addressed and therefore wouldn't happen again. But that, in fact, a couple of hundred years ago, I'm in the process of writing a history of crime reporting, which is why I go back to all this time. But a couple of hundred years ago, there was a servant called Elizabeth Fenning in London, whose employers were taken ill with what was clearly food poisoning, but she was accused of having poisoned them because they found some arsenic missing in the house, and because she'd just been told off by her mistress for flirting with the apprentices, she was accused of attempted murder. She pleaded her innocence. The case was taken up in early days, like an early Paul Foote took up her case, somebody called William Hone. The wonderful artist Robert Cruikshank painted her with her Bible in the Old Bailey on trial. It had no effect at all, and she was hanged. Nobody had died. It was clearly a case of food poisoning, but it was the first, I think, probably the first reported case where the media and the public had got involved in what was clearly a miscarriage of justice. That was 1815. Then in 1903, a case that you may be familiar with, somebody called George Edalji, who was an Anglo-Indian lawyer, was accused of a weird crime in Staffordshire of disemboweling a horse. It became a big subject, and Arthur Conan Doyle believed in the man's innocence, wrote about it in the Daily Telegraph, campaigned on his behalf, and after 3 years he was finally released. And Julian Barnes has written a book about it called Arthur and George, which was turned into a television play last year, some of you may be familiar with. So that was 100 years on, 1903. And Arthur Conan Doyle also got involved in a case up in Glasgow, where a German Jew called Oscar Slater was convicted of the murder of a wealthy Glaswegian woman, and appeared in court, was convicted, was sentenced to death. Conan Doyle and others got involved. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, but it took another 18.5 years before he was released. And at the time of his conviction, it was very clear that he was not the person involved. But there was a mood in the country, in Scotland as well as in England, that it was disturbing to people if one challenged a conviction. It damaged one's confidence in the criminal justice system. This is what the Scotsman, writing in 1908 about this, said: "Efforts most harmful and ill-advised are being made to work up popular feeling and to receive signatures with the object of obtaining a reprieve for the man Oscar Slater, who now lies under sentence of death. However amiable may be the sentiments that have prompted some of those who have taken part in the movement, it is one that cannot be otherwise than mischievous and futile." And those of you who remember the Birmingham 6 case and all of those others will recall that there was this revulsion at the idea that there could possibly be a miscarriage of justice, and it was almost better for an innocent man to hang than for people to lose their confidence in the way the law worked. Then in 1952, the case in Cardiff, which has got a dreadful reputation for miscarriages of justice, if there's any Welsh people here, a Somali sailor called Mahmoud Matan was accused of murdering a pawnbroker, a woman called Lily Volpat, slashing her throat. Very little evidence against him, apart from the fact that a black man had been seen running from the crime. Very, very quick trial in those days, and very, very swift conviction and execution. His lawyer described him as he was half child of nature, a semi-civilized savage, so he was trying to explain why he might have got involved in this, didn't do a proper job defending him. And his wife, he was married to a Welsh woman, and his wife was not even told on the day that his execution was due to take place. She went to visit him in prison, and outside was a notice saying that he'd just been hanged that morning. His family kept on, this is 1952, kept on trying to prove his innocence. And finally, in 2001, the government accepted this and gave the family £1.4 million in compensation, although obviously no compensation to the family involved. Then a couple of cases that you will be probably familiar with. Timothy Evans, who was hanged, was convicted hanged at Pentonville prison in 1950 for murdering his wife and baby daughter. He pleaded his innocence as well, and the person who carried out those particular murders, John Reginald Christie, who was the landlord of 10 Rillington Place, where the murders took place, pleaded guilty 3 years later to murdering a total of 7 women, and he was hanged on the same scaffold as Timothy Evans, the innocent man, had been hanged earlier. Ludovic Kennedy, the late Ludovic Kennedy, wrote a book about it called 10 Rillington Place, and it was the beginning of journalists and the media in general getting more and more involved in the possibility that not only were there historic cases of people being victims of miscarriages of justice, but they were carrying on at the present time. In 1961, those of you who are going to see the Hangmen will recognize many similarities to the case that you'll be watching. Somebody called James Hanratty was arrested for the murder of Michael Gregston, who had been shot dead with his partner in a car. And Hanratty was from an Irish background. He was a convicted criminal. He was a burglar. He had many criminal convictions. He protested his innocence right the way through. It had no effect, and he was hanged in 1962. Paul Foote wrote an excellent book about the case called Who Killed Hanratty, and that was again a kind of signal to people that these cases that had happened, that there had been little protest about at the time, but had been shown later to be miscarriages of justice. Then in 1974 we get the Irish cases that they were, as they had known. I don't know if any of you heard the Reunion, Sue McGregor's program on Radio 4 last week, but they gathered together people involved in the Birmingham 6 case, and it was indeed very shocking. They picked up 6 men who were on their way to Ireland for the funeral of somebody called James McDade, an IRA man, and they picked them up more or less on the basis of the likely suspects. They found through a faulty test that there were traces of what was supposedly nitroglycerine on their fingers. They offered them the easy way or the hard way. The easy way was to sign a confession. The hard way was to be beaten up. They all appeared in court heavily bruised and damaged. Some of them did eventually confess, although the confessions were withdrawn at their trial, but they went to prison and they stayed there for the next 17 years. This was followed by the Guildford Four, four young people, 3 men and a woman living in a squat, who were arrested for the Guildford bomb, in which others were killed. Again, despite the fact that other IRA men who'd already been convicted admitted that they had carried out this bombing, they were convicted, they went to prison, and including some of their relatives who were the Maguire Seven, as they were known, who went to prison again on completely bogus evidence as having been making a bomb factory in London. So what you get from those cases is a pattern. You have a horrible crime, somebody having her throat cut in Cardiff, a horse being disemboweled, which of course to most British people is worse than murdering a human being. The horrible murder of Michael Gregston and the shooting of his partner and rape, bombings in Birmingham, bombings in Guildford, young people enjoying a drink in the evening and being blown to bits. So there's enormous pressure on the police to find somebody for it. It's a horrible crime, and we all want people to be punished for it. You then have the likely suspects are arrested. They're black, or they're Irish, or they're Anglo-Indian, or they have a criminal background, or they're, in that very early case we talked about, they're servants. And there is a desire that there shouldn't be a challenge of their guilt, and they should go away and be punished. And you have also a legal and political establishment which is very anxious that the boat is not rocked. This is what Lord Denning said in 1980 during an appeal by the Birmingham Six. This is long before they were released, long before those scenes of them outside the Old Bailey as free men. And he was very much against their appeal. He said, just consider the course of events if their action were to proceed. If the 6 men failed, it would mean that much time and money and worry would have been expended by many people to no good purpose. If they won, it would mean that the police were guilty of perjury, that they were guilty of violence and threats, that the confessions were involuntary and improperly admitted in evidence, and that the convictions were erroneous. That is such an appalling vista that every sensible person would say it cannot be right that these actions should go any further. And it crystallized, I mean, in that wonderful language, one of the reasons why so many people were kept behind bars wrongly for so long. Because either it's a waste of time trying to find out if somebody's innocent or not, waste of time, waste of money, why bother? Or it means that the police have been violent and dishonest, which in the Birmingham Six case, they very much were. They behaved appallingly. So when people tried to take that case on, the Birmingham Six, there was enormous resistance to it. Chris Mullin, the former Labour MP, who was a journalist with Tribune and various television companies before that, he was the person who really got the Birmingham Six case going. And when he did, the headline in The Sun was, "Looney MP backs bomb gang." That was the thanks that he got for trying to prove the innocence of 6 people who had been beaten up and framed for the Birmingham case. And so the cases went on. In 1988 in Cardiff, there was another scandalous case involving a young woman called Lynette White, who was a sex worker, who had her throat slit and she was stabbed to death. 5 young men, all black, were arrested. There was very little evidence against them. except for 2 other sex workers and a neighbour who eventually came forward and said that they'd seen them leaving the scene. It took a number of years before this case fell apart, and the DNA proved that another man, Geoffrey Gafford, had actually carried out the murders, and he pleaded guilty to them. What happened after that was that the 2 sex workers who claimed to have seen the men and the neighbour who claimed to have seen the men, who'd made their evidence up, were then charged with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice and jailed for 18 months. Amazingly, this is what the judge said as he sentenced them, Justice Madison: "I accept that you were seriously hounded, bullied, threatened, abused and manipulated by the police, as a result of which you felt compelled to agree to false accounts they suggested to you." He said, he added, what they'd been subjected to was unacceptable in a civilized society, but he still jailed them for 18 months. So what happens to the police who had bullied these people into lying? 13 of them were arrested and charged in 2009, the largest number of police officers ever charged in this country. But miraculously, vital papers in the trial disappeared, and in 2 years ago, the trial was halted by the judge, Mr. Justice Sweeney, and thrown out. So the only people who went to prison for this fabrication were the 2 vulnerable young women and the neighbour, and the people who had been falsely accused. Now, the media has had quite an honourable role in many ways in some of these cases. Chris Mullin got World in Action involved to test the nitroglycerine test, as it were, and found that all the men on all the Birmingham 6 had been playing cards on their way to the funeral. The backs of old playing cards give off exactly the same test, the same types of scientific test as nitroglycerine, and that was what the faulty test on which they had been convicted. Now, that cost a lot of money to get those tests done. World in Action, Granada TV, great series of programs, had that money and they were able to do it. It costs money. They didn't have, had it not been for that intervention, the Birmingham 6 might still be inside. At that time, there was a television program called Rough Justice, which also took on cases, and between 1982 and 2007, I think a total of 18 people were freed as a result of the cases that they'd taken up, investigated, examined, done scientific work on, and proved their innocence. Channel 4 had another program called Trial and Error, which between 1993 and 1999 did terrific work too, and led to other people's cases being overturned. But they cost money, these cases, to investigate. A rough justice program cost up to £100,000 a time. We'll come on to that in a moment. Anyway, as a result of that, there was this kind of great feeling of sympathy for people who'd been victims of miscarriage of justice, a recognition that it was happening in a lot of different places, and something called the Criminal Cases Review Commission was set up in 1997 to look at alleged miscarriages of justice. Since then, they have had nearly 20,000 cases put in front of them. Of these, 595 have gone back to the Court of Appeal, and of those, 392 cases have had their appeals allowed. Currently, there are 864 being reviewed and another 559 awaiting this enormous. Now, many of these may never see the light of day. It's somebody sitting in the front row who knows all too well how long this process takes and how painful it is. But it gives you an idea of the scope, the enormous scope of people who may well have been victims of miscarriages of justice. They now face many problems. They face, in trying to prove their innocence, There's been cuts in legal aid, as you know, over the last few years, which means that they're less likely to get proper legal representation when their case starts. There have been cuts in the budget of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, so hence that enormous backlog, hence the enormous amount of time it takes to investigate cases. There's been an enormous increase in the numbers of people in prison. In 1970, when we're talking about some of these earlier cases, there were 39,000 people in prison in Britain. There are now 85,000 people in Britain. It's an enormous increase in the number. There is also a certain lack of interest within the media. Rough justice was deemed to be too expensive, and the way that the BBC is under attack at the moment, there's no way in the world that they're going to be allowed to operate again, because it will be seen as too frivolous, the idea of getting people out of prison who've been wrongfully imprisoned. Channel 4 dropped Trial and Error because they said that they thought it was rather 1980s, and so they don't have that anymore. It's not quite reality enough to carry on paying for that to carry on. And so other cases are dependent on, to a certain extent, on a whim. There's a recent case, a young man called Sam Hallam, who successfully appealed against his murder conviction. He was one of a group of, he was deemed to be one of a group of young men who had carried out a murder and was innocent. It took him many years to prove his innocence. And Paul May, who's a great campaigner, who campaigned for the Birmingham Six, campaigned for Sam Hallam and many others, tried to get publicity for it, and ITV eventually agreed, but on the understanding that Ray Winston, whose nephew was a friend of Sam's, would take part. That was the kind of quid pro quo. Paul May said, you know, it was almost they wanted Anton Deck to be involved if they were going to actually give it prime time and television. So that's the difficulties that people face. They take a long time to investigate miscarriages of justice cases, and there is an element of cynicism sometimes about them. You would probably, if you're from London, you probably remember the case of George Davis, who was wrongly convicted on a robbery case. There were lots of George Davis's Innocent OK paintings and graffiti all over London. And his campaigners dug up the test match pitch at Headingley. And then, sadly, George, having quite rightly being released, got carried away with himself and did carry out subsequent robberies, and that did a lot of damage to other genuinely innocent people. And Razor Smith, Noel Smith, who's a prisoner who writes poems, has kind of joked about the fact that lots of people claim to be innocent in his poem Old Lags, where he says, yeah, I've been stitched right up. It's funny you should ask. I'm here for what I didn't do. I didn't wear a mask. But that was the level of cynicism which greeted the George Davis case. But we now are in a situation where there are hundreds of people trying to get their cases heard. They find it very difficult to do so. There are some great organizations like Inside Justice, which is part of Inside Times, where Louise Shorter, who used to be at Rough Justice, works. The Justice Gap, you can go online for. I'm more than happy to point you in directions if people are interested. We're here in the Royal Court. A couple of months ago I was in the Royal Courts of Justice listening to an appeal of somebody called Kevin Lane, who's actually sitting in the front row here. He had been in prison a total of 18 years? No, 20. He was convicted of carrying out a so-called hitman murder in Hertfordshire of somebody called Robert McGill back in 1994. And strangely, when I was working at The Guardian, I covered the actual murder. And there was a corrupt policeman involved in that case who subsequently went to prison. There were two very obvious suspects who are currently inside for carrying out another hitman murder. And it it seemed like there was a very clear case for Kevin to have his conviction quashed. To explain the difficulty of highlighting these cases, I wanted to go and interview Kevin when he was in prison up in Durham, and it took nearly a year to get permission from the Home Office, and our interview had to be conducted in the presence of a prison officer, somebody from the Home Office, and the whole thing had to be taped. And there's enormous red tape now put in the way of any attempts to get to highlight particular cases of miscarriages of justice. At the Royal Courts of Justice, Kevin's case was presented with, in a very articulate way by Joel Bentham, his QC, but there seemed to be very little interest from the appeal court bench and was knocked back. And it is happening time and time again that there's a feeling now that both politically and from the media's point of view that there isn't a great concern about people. Another recent case was somebody called Victor Neelan, who DNA evidence proved that he was not the person involved in an attempted rape. He came out after 17 years. As Kevin would explain, if you continue to protest your innocence, you serve much longer than if you accept it, because you're deemed not to have come to terms with your offending behaviour. Neelan came out, he was given £46 and as he left prison, and the government has now decided that you don't get compensation. The Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4 did at least get some compensation to help them start life outside. You don't now get any compensation unless you can prove that somebody else did the crime. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation. Anyway, that's more or less what I had to say. I'm going to take any questions or points from people, or if anybody would like Kevin to explain a little bit more about his case, then feel free to. So, is there anybody who would like to... Kevin, do you want to say a word or two about how long it took to get your... Is there a mic here? Yeah. Here we are.
Okay. Evening everybody. Nice to meet you all. I didn't quite expect this, but if it helps people in my position, then obviously it's all good. It took 20 years for me to get released by pure, I believe, a police officer thought that an injustice was taking place because my solicitor received some documents from the police files that was sent anonymously. Up until that point, in 2010, I received a letter from the Home Office and it said, "You shall never be released. You shall die in prison. You shall remain in prison indefinitely." And I was told that. I thought, I better go back to the cell and write another letter, which I did. I wrote over 10,000 letters. I never had a TV, and I made it my campaign, as well as my family and friends, and a lot of support. Otherwise I wouldn't be here now. But I went to the Court of Appeal. And I went to the Court of Appeal with some evidence that was overwhelming. I mean, Duncan was there, Newsnight was there was various journalists there. It was overwhelming. You have a corrupt police officer acting corruptly within your case, tampering with evidence that was put before a jury where they've made a decision. You're having visiting the original suspects at home and going into prison pretending to be a solicitor. And it goes on and on and on, and that's just a snippet of what was put before the Court of Appeal. And they turned around and said I was building houses out of straw. It's disgusting. You cannot have the principles of law within this country where if the evidence put before that jury is tampered with or falsified, that subsequently led to your conviction being found, it isn't right. And what pillars of justice do we build our principles on? Are they made of straw? Because it just seems that the police family is far-reaching. It goes right to the higher echelons within the criminal justice system. The Chief Crown Prosecutor of my case took early retirement because I wrote to him and said, "I'm going to hold you responsible for what you were doing to me." He wrote back to me and said, "There's been a letter placed in your file you are not to be replied to." I thought, "I've got something for you." And I wrote to him about a point in my case. He wrote directly back to me and said, "I'd like you to use me as principal point of contact in relation to that point." It was due to evidence that they said had gone missing. They didn't know the exact geographical location of it. Rough Justice wanted access to that. mine would have been one of the last cases that Rough Justice did, and it was closed. Okay, anyway, listen, I hope that helped you. Just give you some idea of what takes place. Thank you for coming.
Yes. Anybody else got a point they want to make? Sorry.
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
The podcast released like last year, Serial. I know it was a US-based case,
Yeah.
but obviously that was very prolific in London and probably in the UK. Do you think that's going to affect kind of the ability to produce things cheaper because it's podcast rather than TV, and also just media and general public awareness of miscarriages of justice?
Yes, I think certainly it enthused a lot of people, and there are, what I didn't mention, there are these innocence projects, but something that started in America around law faculties at universities. Students took on particular cases and tried to investigate them pro bono, as it were. And I think, you know, anything like that serial that encourages people to investigate it is advisable. The problem is that quite often, if it's DNA testing or stuff that involves any kind of scientific investigation or tracking down people, they can be expensive. But certainly I agree that that's one way for people to involve. I think one of the other problems is that they do take a long time to investigate. All newspapers are losing circulation, and young reporters, their news editor can tap in and see how many stories they've written in the last 12 months. If you're working on something like a miscarriage of justice story, it can take a month, 2 months, and at the end of it, it may not turn out to be true. The last thing you want to do is get it wrong. And I think for young journalists starting, they think, can I give up a month or 2 months and then not have a byline at the end of it? And I think that's one of the worries. And therefore, I hope the Innocence Projects, that there's more than 20 universities involved here, but it's kind of long shots. And in the end, one is often dependent on a good lawyer. There are very few wonderful lawyers like Gareth Pierce, James Saunders, Tim, I could rattle off a number of them, but they're few and far between who are prepared to work more or less for nothing in that dedicated kind of way. Yeah, down here.
Yeah, has there been any reaction by the justice system as a result of these unsafe convictions?
Well, they did introduce the Criminal Cases Review Commission. I mean, that very first case, one of the very early cases we talked about, the Hanratty case that Conan Doyle was involved in, the appeal court was introduced after that in 1907. After all the scandal of the Birmingham Six and so on, they did eventually set up the Criminal Cases Review Commission. And, although they're terribly slow and inadequate in many ways, more than 300 people have gone through that system and have been freed or cleared. But the current mood in this country is not sympathetic either to people claiming to be innocent or to places like the BBC spending a lot of time and highlighting cases. And it is often only when a case is highlighted, as Chris Mullen did with the Birmingham Six, that it has the legs to go off and back to the Court of Appeal. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you aware of any challenges to the compensation issue? Because it seems extraordinary that it seems illogical actually that somebody should have to find, or there should be somebody else found guilty in place of somebody whose innocence has then been proven,
right?
Or who have been then found not guilty in the past case. It's not a logical piece of law. I was just wondering if you're aware of any challenges.
Yes. There was a challenge made by Victor Neelan, who was the former postman who was wrongly convicted of a sexual assault and spent 17 years. He made a challenge, although the DNA on the woman he was alleged to have attacked was turned out not to be his. The DNA gets more sophisticated in terms of the way it can be traced. He and Sam Hallam, who was the young man I referred to that Ray Winston got involved in his case, they jointly challenged the government, the Ministry of Justice decision not to give them any compensation, and they failed in their attempts. So the only thing that could change that now would be a political change, which I think this government is unlikely to do. It's seen as a way of saving money. They're expensive miscarriage of justice cases. The normal compensation is depending on the amount of time you've spent inside and whether you had a criminal record before, but it can run to hundreds of thousands of pounds. Quite rightly, people's lives have been stolen from them. So the challenges have been made, but they have been unsuccessful. Yeah, the other particular points, yes?
I'd like to ask what happened to the policeman in the case of the gentleman in the front row who was found to have...
Well, he went to prison for something not in connection with Kevin's case, but for fraud and...
He went to prison for stealing £160,000 from his police force. He forged and fabricated death certificates and licences to get that, and letters of truth within the police force. And he also went to prison, which was suppressed until now, for growing his own cannabis. Digging up criminals' cannabis plants in their crops and replanting them in the middle of the night with other criminals in a 3.5-ton wagon. And they suppressed that. And that was found to be true in 2006. Well, as 2008 by Sally Chittle, the BBC, and they wouldn't answer a letter and put the shutters down, refused to answer anything. And that was in relation to my case as well. What I would like to say very quickly is, if they pay you compensation, they take a third off you for bed and board and food.
That's right. Another case that I haven't mentioned, but also a murder case, which was a couple of guys convicted of 2 murders back in the 1970s. And a little while after they were convicted, the person who'd given evidence against them, a man called Tony Wilde, approached me and said he'd become a born-again Christian, and he said that he'd made up the evidence against them. So we ran a story in The Guardian. The police went down to see him, and they said to him, you do realise that if you carry on saying that, you could be charged with perjury and go to prison for 7 or 8 years. So on his lawyer, a local Brighton lawyer, told him to answer no comment to all further questions. So it was another 4 or 5 years before he was given immunity, and he was allowed to give evidence that he had made up his evidence. And then the Reg Dudley and Bob Maynard were released, and they were given, I think, something like £300,000 in compensation. But they charged them bed and breakfast for all the time that they'd spent in Parkhurst and Belmarsh, not Belmarsh, Brixton and so on. I can't remember exactly how much it would cost, but it's like Airbnb, that sort of level. It's about £30 a night that they took off their compensation because they'd had that wonderful Her Majesty's Prison bed and breakfast and porridge put out. How are we doing for today? Yeah, I think we're allowed one more.
I'm afraid I'm a proud Cardiff girl.
Right. Well, you should get on to those South Wales please then.
That was going to be my question.
Yeah.
I feel we've had more than our fair share of miscarriage of justice, because they're more than the 2 that you have referred to. Is it just coincidence, or do you think there is a systemic problem within the South Wales police force?
I saw the 13 of them when they appeared in court. They came up, I think it was 2009 or something like that. And it was a wonderful sight in some ways because quite a few of them were retired and so on, and you felt that what had happened to these 3 young black guys, at last they were going to get some kind of justice. But as I also went along to their trial, and it was amazing how swiftly it fell apart. And I do think that, there was there's a very good book on it by Satish Sekar, who's done a lot of work in the case. It's called Proved Innocent. And the reinvestigation, the police who carried out the reinvestigation did a very good job, and I think were very diligent and should be congratulated, but they were very badly let down by the prosecution, who lost these vital papers. There is, I think, a government, if there is one of these endless inquiries going on into why it went wrong, but it is a scandal, and I think it is probably now being addressed within South Wales, but it's a real stain on the reputation of that whole police force. I think that it was still going on in that time.
May I just add to that, please? Just your impression was, is it systematic? Those documents that were released to me, to my solicitor, was placed in the CCRC to investigate. The handling of those papers was handed over to a superintendent and chief inspector, retired, now working in the cold case unit. They was picked to go into the files where these documents were meant to have come from. They did that. 20 days later, they went back to the CPS and told them there was a conflict of interest because they were comrades of the police officer they was investigating. And guess what? Those documents went missing. They don't exist. But we knew they did exist because when there was an undercover operation taking place by the Court of Appeal, we had no idea of that. But the source that sent those papers to us from the police force phoned my solicitor and said, I'm the source that sent you those papers. The police files have been searched that they came out. So we contacted the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal accepted there was an undercover operation, which confirmed in the first instance that those papers existed. But they went missing. So it is systematic. And it goes right to the top.
I think we're kind of running out of time. Is that right, Chris? Yeah. Just a couple of things. I mean, I've been sitting, I was going through my notes outside and looking at the. I'm not giving anything away about the plot, but I noticed amongst the. It is called the Hangmen, this play that you're going to see. I noticed that there was the hangman's noose and the restraining bonds. The one good thing is, thank God, there is no death penalty anymore, because a lot more innocent people would have been hanged. But there are, if you are interested in it, I do recommend that you Google or explore. I can certainly give you the names of books that are worth reading up about it. The Justice Gap is a good website. The Inside Justice is a good website. You can find Kevin's story on the Guardian website. And it is a rolling scandal that I don't think enough is done about, either politically or in the media. And maybe after you've seen the play or thought about it more, you can feel that you would want to know more about it. But anyway, thank you all very much for coming along tonight.